bit of a I'm groping for a sports metaphor here, but it's not going to come. We've just had a little bit of a last-minute discussion up here about exactly how we want to structure this unstructured part of the events, and there's sort of two ideas that I hope we can link together. One is that I think it would be really interesting to think about what are the kind of common threads and through lines that have come out of the day, because so many of the papers do speak well together. And then the other is, what are some of the leftover questions that people have that they want to bring up? Are there things that people, either speakers or other people in the audience, haven't had a chance to say, want to say, common threads that you see? So I think it's really a free-for-all. I think we want to open by turning it out, and then we will jump in as we see fit. So questions, comments, summative kinds of statements.
That's dangerous.
I know it is, but what the hell? Banu.
So I'm interested in this term patriarchy that's in the title. Yeah. Do we want to return to it? And why? Because it sort of disappeared from the feminist vocabulary, so I'd be curious.
Oh, you're all looking at me, aren't you? It's a very good question. Okay, some of it was simply alliterative. And we always like a good pussy. Patriarchy goes well together in all kinds of ways, for some people. But in all seriousness, I mean, it's an interesting question, because I think that you're right. It has gone out of favor, and in some ways rightly so. But I've always been for bringing it back, and part of the reason I think is because it speaks to a kind of overweening system of structural, intimate, relational male dominance that other frameworks simply don't get to. I mean, if you use it in its sort of the critique of it, of course, is that, it no longer describes the world as it is, and that male dominance no longer works from the sort of the rule of the father, of the patriarch. Well, yeah, it kind of still does, but the father's proliferated. And the father might not look like, Big Daddy, but he might look like Big Brother, and he might look like the state. So, I mean, for me, I actually like that it resonated again here, that we heard people, and that there's not necessarily the resistance. Perhaps we're moving to a time where the resistance to that term, which I understand, might be pushed back again a bit. I guess that's my answer to some of that.
Can I just follow up on that
you
just
can,
for a moment?
Go ahead.
Because it's certainly, I think there are really good reasons, again, for the term to have fallen out of favor. I'm contemplating teaching the introduction to women's gender and sexuality studies, and one of the things I was thinking about was that really the last time I taught this class, we did talk about patriarchy, and that I would feel very uncomfortable doing that were I teaching it again. But actually, so with a sort of open or blank slate mind, I was really interested to see how often in what was discussed today that really did seem to be the appropriate word to characterize something. And I mean, that's just what you said, Suzanna, but I just want to point to a couple of the places, and now everybody's name, including people I know really well, is leaving my mind. But the paper on Sarah McKinnon's paper on the differential ways in which women's, either straight or gay, in which women's asylum claims might be seen or represented, the hypermasculinity of Putin. I mean, where you have to have a certain kind of patriarchal conception in order for any of that to make sense. So I did keep seeing things that it seemed like a really good word to capture. And the other thing that I just wanted to say is, the really fabulous thing about neoliberalism and late capitalism is that they can absorb almost any other state of domination, right? So it's not like just because we have neoliberalism, like now we at least don't have patriarchy, right? So I don't think we need to.
We've got both.
We've got both in different sense. Yeah. Jyoti.
So I would like to push back a little bit on it. And I'm glad Bonnie raised this sort of the issue of patriarchy. And I took it as that a little bit, interesting. And I have the culture and I love the title. But in a kind of, in an analytical way, aside from the sort of the obvious, the problems that have been long pointed out around patriarchy, is that, in so many ways, that if we had seen something like Elizabeth's presentation, primarily through the lens of patriarchy, it would have obfuscated or not allowed so much of the nuance that Elizabeth brought forward, right? That precisely, one of the things in terms of, especially as some of us who are sexuality studies scholars, which I think a lot of us because of who you brought together, so many of us are, that part of the problem has been precisely the ways in which patriarchy obfuscates sexuality as part of, as not the same as tied, as related, but not the same, or race. How quickly that sort of falls out of the analysis precisely when we think about that. So again, I'm harkening back to some of the ongoing problems with it, but I'm to even sort of suggest that so much of the richness that we saw today would have disappeared very quickly had we been working precisely, with sort of that as somehow undergirding or overlaying or, somehow as still as relevant or as the framework through which we can make sense of this.
Kimberly, did you want to speak to this?
I will say that in the intro class, we have to first start at this position point, because at 18 3/4, they're not thinking about patriarchy in the way that we might think that they're thinking about patriarchy. So we do have to.
They really believe it's over.
Yes.
So you sort of have to remind them that it's still there, even as you complicate it. Again, I guess what I would just say in response to that, I totally agree with you, and I don't, use it in my writing very much in that way at all, but there is a way in which, one can talk about it, I would hope, and still, the fact that we were able to use that language here in the complexities, with talking about sort of patriarchal social relations and sexualized social relations and race social, that they're not mutually exclusive categories, but the concept of patriarchy does, in a rhetorical sense, in a sort of political move too, sort of capture, I think, a kind of topography of range of dominance and of penetration, dare I say it, that, other terms sort of are limper. I'm going with this. Folks, I'm going with this. More questions?
I have a general question about categorical thinking in our discussion of invisibility of sexual orientation and definition of asylum seekers and other things that came up in questions. For example, seeking protection as a member of a certain category and looking to affiliate with members of the category to provide support. So in all cases, we are thinking in terms of categories, and I wonder whether we could benefit in any way from shifting to a more feature-based approach, something which Rebecca Jordan-Young argues for. To borrow Sally Slender's example, if there are people who, for example, by virtue of having a uterus and a vagina could be raped and left pregnant, these people will need certain type of protection that people who do not have these features will not need. Do you think this could be a good approach? Is it even possible to base a human rights movement on features rather than categories? And is it possible, does our legal system ever work in terms of features rather than categories?
That's for Susan.
I don't have a good answer to that, except to say that we do have a good example of that from HIV organizing, which is that in the early 90s, when gay men started getting conflated with HIV, there was a move to say we should actually talk about the act and not the identity. So we should talk about anal sex and not talk about, and I've actually just written a paper about this, and it's called Rugged Vaginas and Vulnerable Rectums. It's about like an actual moment where Discover Magazine published this thing saying that women have rugged vaginas so they won't contract HIV. But interestingly, what you see in the HIV movements internationally is that you have this new category of men who have sex with men, which is meant to be an act, not identity, like a move away from the category, and it's become an identity category. So now if you go to HIV meetings, at least at the international level, the ones that I participate in, a lot of people, you go around the room and say who you are, who you represent. People will self-identify as MSM instead of gay. So, that's not a perfect response to your, I think we should do it just to do it to see what happens, but I don't know that I think it just feels like it's just going to keep going in different directions. It's not just, can we have a human rights movement based on people who have anal sex? Although there's an interesting organization called it's like the Organization for Rectal Microbicides, and their whole thing is getting to the bottom of it. And it's, the idea that we develop a sort of HIV intervention that's based on, and their whole thing is that, we can all come together around the one thing that we can all do, meaning different sexual identities, which is anal sex. So I actually told myself a week ago that I was going to stop raising anal sex in public. And but, yeah.
But it might also speak to a sort of failure of rhetoric or failure of language that gets to Suzanna's paper, Peter's paper as well, because as you were presenting, I just kept thinking, how can we change this term? How can we use what's a better, I can't think of anything, so I don't know. But I can think of a lot of failed terms that don't sort of get to the point. I also wrote down in my notes, how do we get rid of patriarchy and keep Pussy Riot? That's right. That's a central concern.
I don't have an answer to Nadia's question, so this is a little bit back to Jyoti's question. I'm also thinking about the whole issue of co-creation, because when I was writing my paper, I got so interested in the issue of sycophancy. How is it that beta males create the notion of an alpha male and they go along with the whole ritual and they play with it? So I wondered if other people are also interested in that. And I think it's a failure of the word patriarchy because it assumes that the dominance comes from above, whereas as you showed in your paper, there's a lot of mythic creation of the state from below. And as Lori showed, there's a lot of ideas and ways of framing things that are circulating. So it's not just one dominant patriarchy imposes. It's really this much more fluid and I just, in listening to all the papers, I was really struck by how malleable the immigration is. And asylum and these things keep recreating themselves. It's just very interesting. So that's, I think, another argument against.
Yeah, I think that has been some of the resistance to and some of the critique of the term patriarchy has long been that there is, not just that it sort of has a historical, a lifespan at this point, but also that it's a term that it has trouble. Making more fluid, that it's a term, unlike what we've done with sort of femininities and masculinities and the way in which, and sexualities and the way we pluralize them as conceptual terms. Patriarchies is hard, it has a singularity as a concept that I think has lent to it a dehistoricized, a decontextualized kind of aura that has been problematic for a lot of us. I agree. Just have a retro fondness for it. What can I tell you?
Well, Amanda, in the English department. But as you're saying this, what I was thinking about was we started the day with your talk, and you were talking about how there's been construed, especially in popular culture, this like particular kind of queerness, right? And in the question and answer, you said when you have sort of a certain kind that's held up, then you create this abstract kind. And then in the papers on asylum, it was these questions of what kinds of narratives are recognizable, and how can we be recognizably oppressed or recognizably in an identity that you're trying to claim asylum for, right? So all of that identity formation is inextricably linked to patriarchy. So I don't know where to go with that.
I sort of wonder if the challenge that we're having with patriarchy is that the term itself has been so sort of tunnel visioned to mean one specific thing that we're not using it in the same intersectional way that all the papers here today. I mean, that was something that I was struck with, and that I actually wrote myself a smiley face note about, that I was so proud to have helped, because we talked about the prison-industrial complex, we talked about immigration, and we talked about international, we talked about all these things through this sort of queer feminist perspective that are much more complicated than what sort of the tunnel definition of patriarchy from above sort of has traditionally been. And so in my head, I'm like, what's the word for the thing that's patriarchy, but that recognizes sort of all those complex, interrelational, intersectional moments in which it, in practice, in different countries with different histories and different trajectories around understanding sexuality, or different histories of colonialism, or different whatever, makes itself apparent, but we have this sort of limited way in which we're used to using it or thinking about it that I think is what's
Laura's going to tell you the word.
Okay.
Well, I think we should use the word transactional patriarchy, because I was thinking when Josie was talking about transactional states and how there's no such thing as the state, right? The state happens through transactions and through people on the ground making decisions, and patriarchy happens similarly. And so when you use transactional patriarchy, you should cite me.
Okay.
Done. But I do think it's similar, because the state and the patriarchy are both transactional.
Was that a tiny beginning of a question over there? No? Okay, Karen and Jody.
So we definitely saw some great intersectional thought at work today, and I'm just curious with the cluster about the other interdisciplinarity, because part of what I'm thinking is the richness in what's happening to us as we listen to this kind of accumulated conversation is actually about the specificity of things like the law. The law is a particular way of thinking, or a work of literature, and what happens in that construction. And I just wonder if anyone has thoughts about kind of what's the value of interdisciplinary in these times, and if that's something, even with patriarchy discussion, we should be pushing further, because Bonnie and I talked about this a lot. I continue to be disappointed at how often it's the buzzword of our times, but how rarely we're actually functioning in robust ways to tackle the same complexity. But interdisciplinarity has a lot to do with that too, but that's not how our jobs are structured often. It's not, even though we know these are interdisciplinary subjects, we can get locked into our really particular methodologies and perspectives. And part of what was so great about today was just seeing people come at things from really different angles. So I don't know whether we do think about that, but it seems really valuable. And you need scientists, more scientists involved in this discussion.
We would like some. Yes. Well, I mean, I will just say for the group, I think one of the things that was so great about this group was precisely that we really did tackle kind of the shared readings and the way in which we approached this together from a really, what I would call sort of a transdisciplinary perspective. Instead of, there's a difference there between sort of a model of the interdisciplinarity as additive and a combination, and transdisciplinary models where we're really talking about ways of addressing problems, social, political, literary problems that come, that the question transcends the kinds of approaches you might bring to it, and the questions orient the kinds of approaches you might bring to it. So I was always, we are everything here. We're literary theorists and media people and lawyers, and it's and we had conversations with ease with each other. I think that was wonderful. Yeah, it was great.
It's going to be good for WGS.
It is coming out of the gender studies program, which that's what we do. But
I think it takes a non-traditional entity within the traditional structure of the academy, right? Because by no means do I think we're particularly transdisciplinary in the academy or here at Northeastern or like anywhere else, but I think it's that we have this unique space with, what's our research cluster called? I don't even know. The section.
Forum on feminist thought.
No.
Sexual citizenship.
We don't know the name of it, but the thing is, they gave us money to get together across disciplines because of Suzanna to like talk about these things, and so we had this unique moment in which we were able to get transdisciplinary, and I think it's an important question that I would like to think about more about how to like make that bigger or wider in the academy in general, but I mean, the state might be like that. This state.
I was going to say something else, but actually this is more important to me now. I would love to hear from all of you what this set of conversations as you see as contributing to your ongoing conversations, and if you think, or I mean, I know it's placing a lot on you while you're still sort of processing it, but how you see today's events shifting or honing or not your discussions in the group.
Within the group or our own?
Among yourselves, yes.
Well, maybe we could answer it from either perspective.
Can we jump in?
You mean from our own disciplinary, like our own work, or as the work?
I was thinking about it in terms of your ongoing conversations, but by all means your work as well, about how it articulates.
Okay, I'll jump in.
Oh, girl.
The couple of things. So I'm a literary person in the group, and I don't want to say much about that. But the thing that, what I find these kinds of conversations do for me when they work really well, which for me, at least this one has, is they often sort of remind me about little questions that have been nagging at the back of my mind that have more to do with my sense of the world in general than my work in particular. And they remind me that there are things that I think it would be really interesting and important to follow up on. And one that has come up for me in this conversation is the whole question of empiricism and data, and which I think is part of a retranslation of sort of what came up in a couple of the first papers, another way of thinking about the question of immutability, but also about the question of what counts as a societal claim. Right? I mean, there's a whole series of questions about what counts as data, what counts as the empirical, how much weight do we want to place on the empirical, that I think those questions are particularly well surfaced by certain kinds of transdisciplinary conversations, and I actually think they're really important, and I think that we still don't talk enough about the kinds of data we use. I mean, we either wave our hands and say, what's his name, Regulus, makes up with data, which of course he does, right? We've moved past the moment, thank goodness, when we could just sort of be dismissive of science. Remember that? But I think it's actually really, really hard to figure out what does and should and could count as data, and that's a conversation that I would love to have.
I was going to almost say just the sort of the inverse thing of that, I guess. No, not really. But actually, one of the things that it reinforced for me, this experience, is actually how much, to continue sort of that transdisciplinary conversation, how much feminist scholars actually do share intellectually. I mean, it's a sort of commonplace thing to say it, but the conversations I had with these folks were far more interesting than anything I have with my sociological colleagues, I mean, you excluded, of course. The questions we share and the bodies of knowledge we share, actually, was surprising to me, given that some of us are, in this group, are more or less interdisciplinary, some are more rooted in actually doing the discipline. Some of us really come from women's studies, others of us don't, but yet we were able to have robust conversations with not just about the material, because we're all smart folks, it's not that, but we actually shared a series of questions about political life, social life, empirical life, we shared questions, but we also shared an intellectual archive that to me is heartening in an era of sort of balkanized university structures. I mean, that felt really actually surprising how much was shared coming from such different environments in this way. So, that's beautiful. Oh, dear God! Yes?
I'm not sure I'm going to articulate this well, but I think one of the things that I most sort of got out of the experience and out of the conference today was I've been thinking personally a lot about the radical potential of academia, or if there is a radical potential of academia, especially because Stuart Hall recently passed, and he was somebody that I admired, whose work I admired greatly, and I had been having a lot of sort of personal I don't feel like this is radical. I feel like this is structured, and it's like I'm working for the man, just like everybody else. I just think I'm freer, So I've been sort of struggling with that a lot, and I think as much as and as fulfilling as it is to sort of be in this, granted, very limited academic space and find these commonalities, these transdisciplinary commonalities, I also think that part of the value of what we did here today was that it's invigorating, at least for me, I can't speak for other people, in terms of taking what we do out into the world and sharing it with people outside of the academy and thinking about how our ideas actually can create radical futures or create queer futures in a way that, we might not be having that conversation in our individual departments or at our individual academic conferences. I'm just saying we might not be. So, I think that's something for me, is something that I'm going to have to think and process a lot more about when I go home later.
So someone
kind of going off of that, we are both undergraduate students at Middlebury College, and I'm really interested in more of the...
I didn't say that.
We're just very happy that you made it.
Welcome.
I'm just really interested in the forum, and it sounds like you guys are trying to bring or engage feminism in the community, and we're not doing that at the moment as far as I know. So I'd just be interested in hearing a little more specifics about the research cluster and then also the forum, and whether there is any potential for doing something like this in a maybe slightly less academic way than undergraduate.
Absolutely. I mean, this was not a kind of high resource, big structural necessity kind of venture. I mean, what we did was we met, about once every 6 weeks or so throughout the...
We've been meeting every 2 months. Because you know what? We drank every time. She doesn't remember how long we had.
Okay, I'm going to shut up now.
What she say? No, go on.
No. Anyway, we met regularly. We chose readings as a group that we wanted to learn about the topic of sexual citizenship. We chose readings, we read them, we did not have a leader. I mean, it was a group endeavor, and then we do get a little money from our humanities center, and I'll bet you have something that would give you a little money. Undergraduate research is big, really. And the idea was that we would have a product, right? And this is our product. Many of the people who spoke are people whose work we read, we brought them here and we brought others here so that we could really talk about the ideas. And that did take a little more money, but getting together and having a regular study group that is not in a classroom and that really is about a question that you decide you want to investigate, I think can be really liberating. And you could decide that your product was that you were all going to volunteer in some kind of organization, right, to learn more about whatever. I mean, since we're talking about takeout, I mean, that's my immediate response.
Absolutely, it's perfect.
I think
Here also has
I don't know what the resources are at your university, so I can't speak to that. But I know here at Northeastern,
Lots of research.
very rich school. They love to give our undergraduate students money to do things that will look like good on paper, right? So like if we had a group of undergraduate students that said like we want to have the Forum on Undergraduate Feminist Thought, where like we meet, you know, every 2 weeks and we read, you know, whatever, and then at the end of the semester we're going to have an open forum for the community, the surrounding community, where we talk about like the everyday, you know, applications of feminism for young women's lives or in young people's lives or something like that. Like I feel like this isn't what I'm pitching, but like I'm just saying like if it was put together correctly, like I could imagine our administration here funding it. So I don't know about I don't know where you are, but I think that there's a way to sort of create those spaces, and I think having a faculty member that will sign on to
you do have a few here. Funny how that works. We see them right now. And we are yes, we have one announcement, and then we are going to go. You want to
wait? Can I do the announcement?
Yes, announcement, and then we're going to go to.
So you heard that Northeastern is going to have a big event on April 3rd on interdisciplinarity. I also want to announce that the Graduate Consortium in Women's Studies, which I am not currently a co-chair of, but never mind, I was recently a co-chair with Faith, is having an event on April 2nd that relates exactly to Sarah's comment about being feminist faculty, advantages, strategies, and challenges, with some amazing keynote speakers, including Suzanna and Faith, right? And Sue Lancer and Evelyn Hammonds. So it's Wednesday, April 2nd from 5:30 to 8:30. It's going to have 4 keynote speakers and then 2 breakout sessions, one on the pre-tenure situation and one on the post-tenure situation. What does it mean to be feminist? And so, because we figured that negotiating the tenure ladder and being an out feminist has its own challenges, and then in the post-tenure situation, there are other ways you can use the feminism. So, anyway, for all of those who are teaching in the academy, this is an event. There are copies of the poster on every table. So.
And with that, no.
Before we go, we should really say thank you to Suzanna and